Peleliu was supposed to be quick. A small island, one airfield, a few days of fighting, and the road to the Philippines would stay secure. But when U.S. Marines hit the beaches in September 1944, they found something far worse than a stubborn garrison. They found a new kind of island defense: caves, tunnels, interlocking fields of fire, and a battlefield that turned every ridge into a trap. What followed was not a short operation, but one of the hardest fights in the Pacific, and one of the most debated victories of the war. Module 1. By late 1944, the Pacific War was entering a decisive phase. American forces had broken through the Central Pacific, MacArthur was moving back toward the Philippines, and planners wanted the Palau Islands neutralized before the next leap west. Peleliu mattered because it held a Japanese airfield and sat on the flank of upcoming operations. On paper, it looked like a necessary step. In reality, it would become a warning about what happens when a battlefield is understood too simply. Peleliu itself did not look like the setting for a months-long ordeal. It was small, roughly 6 square miles, with a 2-strip airfield near the center and a coral ridge system, the Umurbrogol, rising on the island's left side like a broken stone wall. But that terrain was exactly what made the island dangerous. Kunio Nakagawa and his garrison did not plan to die on the beaches in the older style of Japanese island defense. Instead, they built depth. The ridges were honeycombed with caves, dugouts, and concealed firing points, designed so one position could support another and survive bombardment that would have crushed a more exposed defense. That was the first great misunderstanding of Peleliu. American firepower before the landing was enormous. Battleships, cruisers, carrier aircraft, and army bombers hit the island in the days before the assault. To the men waiting offshore, the bombardment seemed overwhelming. Dust, smoke, and silence suggested success. But most of the defenders were not on the surface. They were inside coral caves and mine shafts, protected unless a bomb or shell landed directly into an opening. The closer the invasion came, the more dangerous the illusion became. And that illusion mattered because many expected the battle to end fast. Contemporary histories and later studies agree that American commanders anticipated a short campaign measured in days, not weeks. That expectation shaped the entire opening mood of the operation. The assault force was ready for a hard landing, but not yet for the kind of long, attritional fight that the Japanese had prepared to impose from the high ground. On the morning of September 15, 1944, the 1st Marine Division went ashore. The reef offshore forced the first waves to ride in tracked amphibious tractors rather than ordinary landing craft. The 1st Marines landed on the northern white beaches. The 5th Marines took the center on Orange Beaches 1 and 2. The 7th Marines landed farther south on Orange 3. H hour was 8:30 a.m., and at first the landing followed the familiar rhythm of an amphibious assault: movement, smoke, noise, momentum. Then the Japanese opened fire from positions that had largely survived. The first minutes told the real story. This was not a beach defense built around wasting men in a final stand at the waterline. It was controlled, disciplined fire from guns that had been pre-registered on likely landing routes. The coral reefs slowed the approach. Narrow beaches compressed the landing zones. As the LVTs came in, Japanese gunners struck them from hidden positions. Men and equipment piled into a space already under observation. On the northern flank, the fight for a position later remembered as the point became an early sign that even small pieces of ground on Peleliu could cost far more than expected. By the end of the first day, the Marines had done what amphibious troops must always do: survive the landing, hold a beachhead, and get support ashore. But the price was already severe. Roughly 1,100 Marines became casualties on D-Day, with more than 200 killed, and many early objectives were still out of reach. Momentum existed, but it was fragile. The island had not been cracked open. It had only begun to reveal how hard it would be to reduce. But here is the twist: the beach itself was only the beginning. The real battle was not waiting at the shoreline. It was waiting inland, in the ridges, where bombardment mattered less, maps helped less, and every advance exposed another hidden firing point. That is why Peleliu changed so quickly from an assault to an ordeal. On D-Day afternoon, the Japanese launched a combined infantry and armor counterattack across the airfield area. In earlier Pacific battles, these attacks often ended in disaster for the defenders, and this one failed too. Marine firepower, including heavy weapons and armor, broke it up. Tactically, that was an American success. But strategically, it masked a larger problem. The failed counterattack did not mean the defense was collapsing. It meant Nakagawa could afford to lose tanks and still keep the real core of his system intact inside the Umurbrogol. Over the next phase, the 5th Marines pushed toward the airfield and eastern side of the island, while the 7th Marines drove south. Those advances mattered. The airfield was a prime objective, and securing the southern portion of Peleliu narrowed Japanese freedom of movement. Yet even as the Americans took ground in the lower terrain, fire still came down from the heights. Holding the airfield did not mean owning the battle. The ridges remained the true key. Then the island itself began to wear men down. Peleliu's heat was extreme, with temperatures rising as high as 115 degrees. Water was short. Some of it arrived in old oil drums whose residue tainted the supply. Heat exhaustion and dehydration spread through units already fighting in jagged coral terrain under constant fire. This is one reason Peleliu cannot be understood only as a tactical map problem. It was also a physical breakdown story. Men did not merely fight the enemy. They fought heat, thirst, fatigue, flies, and the cumulative strain of terrain that punished every movement. The 1st Marines, pushing north toward the ridges, hit the hardest wall. The ground there was narrow, broken, and murderous. Ridges channeled movement. Hidden positions covered one another. A cave that seemed silent from one angle could become lethal from another. A bunker bypassed in the morning could still fire in the afternoon. The more the Marines climbed into the coral maze, the more the battle became a chain of small unit actions, grenades, demolitions, flamethrowers, close-range fire, then another cave, another fold in the ridge, another invisible position. By evening on September 20th, the scale of the problem was unmistakable. Official Marine Corps history records that the 1st Marines had made only minor gains against ridges packed with caves, dugouts, and concealed emplacements, and in 5 days had taken nearly 1,700 casualties, more than half their original strength. The 5th and 7th Marines had done better in their sectors, but their own progress was also slowing under the same system of defense. Peleliu was no longer a fast-moving operation. It had become a battle of reduction. And this is where the stakes changed. At first, the question had been whether Peleliu could be secured quickly enough to support larger operations. Now the question was whether the assault force itself was being consumed faster than the island could be taken. When a campaign shifts from speed to exhaustion, command decisions suddenly matter more than bravery alone. Corps Commander Roy Geiger saw that change. On September 21st, after reviewing the situation and casualty reports, he concluded that the 1st Marines were spent. Marine Corps official history preserves the blunt judgment. They were finished. Geiger moved toward relief and reinforcement, ordering an Army regiment from the 81st Infantry Division to Peleliu. Rupertus resisted longer than the tactical situation justified, still believing the island could be secured very soon. But the battle had already disproved that hope. That command moment is one of Peleliu's defining turning points. Not because it ended the battle, it did not, but because it admitted what the battlefield had already proven. The original tempo was gone. Peleliu could not be won by treating it like one more short amphibious operation. It would have to be methodically ground down ridge by ridge, cave by cave, by Marines and soldiers together. But here's the mini cliffhanger: relief did not mean relief from the island. Even after the airfield was taken and the southern ground largely secured, the hardest ground on Peleliu was still ahead. The battle's center of gravity had shifted into the Umurbrogol, and once American forces went fully into that coral fortress, victory would come with a question hanging over it the entire time: was this island ever worth the cost? Module 2. Peleliu had already broken the promise of a quick victory. The beaches were secure, the airfield was in American hands, and the first week had exposed the real shape of the defense. But that only clarified the next danger. The Japanese were not defending a single line. They were defending a network. Every ridge in the Umurbrogol could bleed the attacker, slow the timetable, and force another set-piece assault in miniature. What was at stake now was no longer just the island. It was the cost of finishing the island. Once the battle centered on the ridges, American firepower still mattered, but it worked differently. Air strikes, artillery, and naval gunfire could suppress visible targets and smash exposed structures, yet hidden caves and reverse slope positions often survived. That meant infantry had to close in repeatedly. Flamethrowers, demolition charges, grenades, tanks where terrain allowed, and point-blank artillery became tools of reduction. The problem was not simply killing defenders. It was making sure a position stayed neutralized after it disappeared in dust and smoke. On Peleliu, the difference between damaged and destroyed could be the difference between progress and disaster. This is why so much of the battle unfolded as a sequence of local nightmares rather than one grand maneuver. American troops named features as they encountered them: Five Brothers, China Wall, Wildcat Bowl, Death Valley, Baldy Ridge, because the map became a lived experience of deadly ground. The terrain forced the battle into fragments, and the Japanese defense turned those fragments into separate killing zones. To the men fighting there, Peleliu was less a continuous front than a maze of connected strongpoints. But here is the second twist. Tactical success kept arriving in pieces, while strategic doubt kept growing at the same time. U.S. forces were winning individual fights. They were taking ridges, silencing positions, splitting pockets, and shrinking the defended zone. Yet the battle was stretching from days into weeks, and each gain reopened the same question. If the island's threat had already been largely reduced by American naval and air supremacy, then what exactly was being purchased with each additional casualty? The reinforcement from the 81st Infantry Division mattered because it changed the battle from a battered Marine assault to a broader joint reduction effort. The 321st Infantry began moving on to Peleliu after Geiger's order, and Army units helped continue the fight while Marine formations reorganized or shifted sectors. Official histories from both Marine and Army perspectives show the same reality. This was no longer an all-Marine short action. It had become a campaign of attrition that demanded fresh troops and a more deliberate approach. That shift also corrected a dangerous command assumption. Rupertus had pressed for aggressive momentum and delayed broader Army involvement, partly from confidence in the 1st Marine Division and partly from a belief that the island was close to falling. But the tactical picture did not support that confidence. By the time relief was arranged, the campaign had already shown that optimism could become a liability when it outran the terrain and casualty reality. Peleliu was not lost through courage. It was nearly lost through misreading the problem. In the ridges, the Japanese method held longer than many earlier island defenses had. Nakagawa's system traded space for endurance. Rather than trying to stop the invasion in the surf, he forced the Americans to enter the worst ground on the island and fight for every position at close range. That decision did not save Peleliu for Japan. It did something else. It imposed maximum cost for minimum maneuver room. And in the Pacific, that defensive model would echo in later battles, especially where caves, reverse slopes, and terrain favored the defender. As the Americans tightened control over more of the island, the Japanese pocket shrank but did not suddenly collapse. Official accounts note that the island was even declared secure prematurely in early October, while significant resistance still remained. That detail matters because it captures the peculiar cruelty of Peleliu. Even after the outcome was clear in the conventional sense, the battle still had to be finished physically. That meant more patrols, more cave clearing, more close combat, and more casualties in a fight whose strategic argument was already under scrutiny. And there, at last, is the true turning point of Peleliu, not the landing, not the capture of the airfield, and not the failed Japanese tank attack. The deepest turning point was the moment when the United States won the operational objective but still had to pay the tactical bill. Once the airfield was usable and the island no longer posed any serious near-term threat to MacArthur's flank, the battle's meaning changed. Finishing the operation became less about opening the road and more about closing a fight that had become far more expensive than its planners intended. By October 20th, Marine Corps figures recorded 6,265 casualties for the 1st Marine Division on Peleliu, 1,124 killed in action or dead of wounds, 5,024 wounded, and 117 missing. The same official history estimated 10,695 enemy dead and 301 prisoners of war for the operation up to that point. Later broader accounts of the campaign in the southern Palaus place total American casualties around 9,600 and Japanese losses around 10,900 killed with just over 300 captured. However measured, the cost was severe, especially for an island once expected to fall in a matter of days. The payoff, then, has to be understood on two levels. Operationally, Peleliu did what planners wanted it to do. The airfield was taken. The island could no longer threaten upcoming American movements in the Western Pacific. It later served as a useful, though not indispensable, link in the growing network of American air and sea control. In that narrow sense, the campaign succeeded. But strategically and historically, the battle's legacy is inseparable from controversy. Admiral William Halsey had urged canceling the operation before it began, arguing that the isolated Japanese forces there did not justify the likely cost. Later historians and institutions have echoed the same debate in different forms. Peleliu was one, but it became one of the clearest examples of a battlefield where tactical difficulty and strategic necessity no longer aligned neatly. That is why the battle endures in memory not just as a display of endurance, but as a case study in whether a victory can still be questioned after it is achieved. And that is the final lesson of Peleliu. It was not a defeat for the United States. It was not a pointless fight in the simple sense either, because real operational concerns existed when the plan was made. But it was a battle that exposed the cost of underestimating new defensive methods, overestimating bombardment, and believing that a small island must equal a small campaign. On Peleliu, American troops won the ground and lost the illusion that such victories could still come cheaply in the Pacific. If there is one decision in this story that still deserves debate, it is the moment when the island shifted from urgent objective to costly obligation. If this episode helped you see that turning point more clearly, like the video, share it with another history viewer, comment with the decision you think mattered most, subscribe, and turn on bell notifications so you do not miss the next campaign breakdown.